Chevelle, the North Corridor. Alright. You notice that there's two different versions. This version is, I guess, pre-order exclusive. The other version would be more accurate to the title of this record, North Corridor, because it's mostly some kid looking at a door that seems like a horror film scene. That's cliche, basically. If you've seen the cover, you know what I'm talking about. But anyways, as you can see, these are the albums that this recent lineup with Dean, why am I forgetting his name? Dean fucking Bartonelli, I think is his name. Their brother-in-law, and they've heard that the first three albums, what I remember, was Joe Loeffler. Family issues, guys. And of course, this was the Chevelle I had grown up to. Now, point number one, wonder what's next, as most people will always tell you, as a diehard Chevelle fan, of course, this type of thinking could do us in, which I didn't care for, especially after listening to this, but then again, in recent years, I've come to mature and grow into this. And sometimes some albums, when it comes to Chevelle, they can grow on you. Or in cases like Vinacera, as of recently, you can possibly grow out of them. And I think that was probably the case of why Chevelle hasn't been as much of a successful kind of band as they used to be, or from these past three albums. Because of that. It didn't also help that it chose to have emo haircuts. When they were fine with the haircuts they had, they fixed that during the sci-fi crimes era. And as well as the way they were sounding. They were starting to give the better feel for their music and starting to show a little bit more space rocky stuff as well. But it wasn't, and of course they tried to come back with Hassle to the Bull, but then Gargola happens. And does something we never thought they would do. They would take what they already had created, or at least found a perfect spot to bring them back to this era. And lo and behold, we have La Gargola, which may very well be possibly the best that they had done since that era. And then, of course, that also leaves you what would they would try to come up with next. It makes you curious, and of course, that's where we get into with North Corridor. Now, to say that, the thing is, I have to go off of this album in a way of comparison, because it was such a great, fantastic surprise. Apparently, Take Out the Gunman was pretty successful, managed to reach number one on both modern rock and mainstream rock charts, and I had no fucking clue about it. Because it didn't seem like the point was giving it much airplay, or at least hardly much of the album, the airplay that it deserved. Because there was a lot of other tracks. Even Twinge, I felt like, should have gained some radio airplay. The final track on this album, that closer that keeps you coming back to that album and wanting more. The real question is would they be able to top that record? And could they? Well, what they did with this record, the North Corridor, that we will be discussing, and eventually I will get more in depth sometime later down the road. I want to do a random rock countdown for Chevelle at some point, and for another band, which will be Switchfoot. And I will get to that album later as well, but I will also hold off on doing a random rock countdown for a while, because Weezer didn't work out for me, guys, like I wanted it to. Mostly because I was more focused on trying to do some chords down pat, and maybe hopefully some kids might have attempted to learn something like I did with it, but that didn't really come across very well, and it still hasn't. And then I got cut off while I was building up great momentum, and if it all stayed in one thing, it would have been a much better issue, and whatever. Before I go too far rant, I want to keep this a little shorter than most of my reviews as best as I possibly can, because I tend to go long, as you have done in the past, and why I've... But with this, it's This album in particular doesn't really hold up to the level of experimentation, or at least brought forth on top of layering on top of the same sound and stuff. But in all honesty, what this record does is exactly everything that this era of the band, with Dean in it as bass, has already pretty well established throughout this part of their entire discography. Leaving off from La Gargola, but kind of the guitars specifically. And the thing that really got me, though it doesn't hit me as hard as it used to, but it's still a good riff anyway to try to sink your teeth into, if you get it a chance, at least by first listen, especially coming off of this record. It's very nice, chunky, meaty, but has sort of a saturated sound. Very much so like what the issue was with Venacera, though coming off more like a sci-fi crimes kind of thing, which was sounding a little bit better, but maybe closer house up to the bowl. So in a way, and the growly bass Dean Bertinelli has brought during La Gargola is still intact, and the drums are a lot more. I mean, Sam Loeffler, he's got some nice drumming skills, and he's proven that he can tackle into more jazzy elements, which La Gargola did, and Twinge wasn't, which is why I don't know why they promoted Jawbreaker as a jazzy track. It wasn't. It was just typical Chevelle. I thought that was misleading. I think they really meant to say Twinge, because that one was far more jazzy, and the drums showed that. But anyways, back to the North Corridor. There isn't too much I could possibly say, I mean, towards this album, except, how they handle themselves. For the first 5 tracks, it's pretty well like your run-of-the-mill of Chevelle. But they do some different things, like but then River shows up and kind of does some things that very well are noticeable in a La Gargola kind of fashion. Especially the guitar notes being slightly similar, no, not nearly on like an, sort of Middle Eastern nodes or something. Definitely a different type of, in a tone that's almost kind of sort of, but not like as eerie as hold on a second. As Ouija board off of La Gargola. And, yeah. It's very interesting, but then they try to do this nice little riff that seems like it's going to build into something really, like, booming. But then it kind of goes back to what it was doing with the verse. It's like, okay, that kind of took me out of it for a little bit. But then, right around the bridge of this track, he brings something out of this performance in Rivers that's just really just near the end of this track. He brings this sort of amazing I'm trying to find the lyrics on this one that showed it, but oh my goodness, I can't really find which ones were they. I'm not sure if I got the right. Well, but it was actually something that they did with this track specifically that was just the way he did the vocal delivery on this track just went falsetto-ish or something, but like the typical Chevelle way that worked for this song, that really brought forth when he really boosted out of his higher octaves and whatnot. You'll know what I'm talking about if you hear the track Rivers. And then there's, of course, Last Days doesn't not do much except, talking about burning a witch or something. And of course, by the way, this album, third album to feature Joe Barresi, whom they had worked with within both Hats Off to the Bull and then La Gargola. Because apparently liked it so much they went to La Gargola, and La Gargola turned out really fucking well. And of course, We have North Corridor. They've kept him for a while. It's the first time they've ever really bothered to keep a producer for a longer period of time, and this is like their third. No, wait. Technically, their fourth album, fully on the self-producing themselves as well, or being credited as such. Which was probably the one thing they needed to do, because after Michael Levis Biscuit got really too involved, especially with the mixing process and the oversaturations that Vinacera had, of course, done. And then they just needed this for that. And something about Burn the Witch, like grabbed by the tail, it was kind of interesting. Weird. And then Young Wicked does they have like a choir moment, but it doesn't like stay there for very long. It just kind of comes out of nowhere on first listen. You're not, once you're used to the record, you're kind of like, okay, and it doesn't and you notice it doesn't stay for very long. It doesn't take you, it's just there, and it just doesn't take you out of it, and doesn't stick around as long, so it doesn't completely take you out of it. And that's kind of the start of where things go. And then Warhol's Showbiz is probably one of the better tracks on that, and everyone talks about this track, and mostly because it's the most obviously different of anything Chevelle has honestly done, because it's very sort of industrial sounding, specific or electronic, or very drum and bassy sounding, and especially the way the drum kits are done. It's, I think, the first time they ever use an electronic drum kit, Sam has, and that's on Punchline. And just, I guess, considering themselves as a joke, is the punchline of the joke, or just something else to it. And then Got Burned, or something like being, and then Got Burned kind of being almost like a weird follow-up, I guess, since oh, burn kind of thing is what it was. And that was another heavier track. And then, of course, Shot from a Cannon, which is actually the longest track on this record. I mean, Door to Door Cannibals starts off was the first track. Don't know if I mentioned this already about it. It's pretty heavy, pretty strong. Joyride Omen was the first track I had. Track 3, just like the last album with Take Out the Gunman, lead single, really got me interested, but I was like, okay, this is sort of typical Chevelle, but it's not really fully experimental. But then that changes, and with Shot from a Cannon really does bring a little bit more of other, it seems more typical Chevelle, and then it builds on something else. And then eventually, kind of, unlike the more softer aspects, there are more constructive aspects that La Gargola had that kept you coming back. This one ends on a more distorted feedback sound. That kind of fades, kind of sort of prolongs and fades out and extends the extra time frame. Some people will probably find it annoying. I was like, I don't know about this, and took a third listen. That's the thing that La Gargola had, that this album, it's not fair to have to compare North Corridor and La Gargola for a comparison thing, but it's not like I got much of a choice but to say that this album, comparatively speaking, doesn't hold a candle to it. And it's really just kind of just backtracking on everything that they've done in the past, but it's not in a bad way necessarily, or at least it doesn't. I mean, you notice it's not going to still hold up nearly as well to come back to it nearly as often, but it still holds up well in terms of the band's own discography and as a Chevelle album, and will still keeps you wanting to see what they're going to do next. But it's not La Gargola, and it's not what most people have come to know and love of them from their first 3 albums. But then again, it doesn't need to be. It doesn't have to be. And it's, for an album of itself on its own, they're at a pretty good spot as a group, and they're still holding well. And I heard they did pretty well at this year's Point Fest, especially having to, go on before Deftones, who I honestly not sure, but I would kind of give them the better album, Deftones. But overall, I'd say Door to Cannibals, the riffing is nice. Joyride, of course, is always good. There's a lot of things on here that I think as a Chevelle fan you will people will enjoy. I think, if anything, between this album and La Gargola, I would say would be of the Dean Burr, Tonelli era lineup era of the band. This and La Gargola are probably the better albums that they've had. I mean, sure, Hats Off to the Bull is pretty solid for what they needed to do to prove that they still had that certain something that Sci-Fi Crimes and Vinacera didn't have, that people were wanting more of, and they finally did it and got it with this album. And you know, after a few listens, it's enough to say that I'm willing to put it where to say that, you know what, I'm willing to at least somewhat come back to this album. And yeah, it's going up there in a good pile. It's thumbs up, guys. I don't know if I can. It doesn't necessarily rock as hard all the way like La Gargola does, but it's definitely a fantastic effort, guys. So Chevelle's North Corridor, what did you guys think about it? Leave a comment below. And if you like this video, rock that like button with thrust if you must. Please be sure to subscribe. And as always, guys, keep it random, keep it real, keep it rocking. And I will see you in the next video. Switchfoot, and it's a little belated, but I'll do it. The thing that was kind of holding me back from doing this sooner. But I may actually still do that thing. It's definitely going to be random, guys, when I do it. And hopefully it'll be still within the week of which it takes place. You'll understand. And let's just say this artist kind of rocks in his own way, but he's not necessarily a rock artist. So let's just say it's that kind of random. So I'm gonna do it, guys. I'm gonna wait to do it until I'm done with the Switchfoot album, but I'm gonna do it. Yeah. And again, until next time, keep it random, keep it real, keep it rocking. I'll see you again next video.